l'épisode de la série Partir autrement entre amis.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this VanTUG event. It's nice to have those things organized in a cadence. We have 2 more events coming up soon that we managed to get speakers for. So in a week or so, we'll announce the next 2. And then kind of end of September, we secured a room at Microsoft. So we have an in-person event in there as well. And we'll be announcing that soon. And the idea is to make something bigger and have potentially 3 speakers and a few sponsors for pizza, drinks, and so on, some giveaways. So we're looking forward to that as well. We'll probably give it another minute. We still have people joining. So this presentation, I usually introduce another speaker. Today, I'm introducing myself, which is kind of funny. The goal is to present the Azure Virtual Desktop product, what it is, what's the purpose, and how we can use it to make every person productive anywhere, be it, a normal staff worker, someone with high graphics requirements, external people, and even developers. So we'll start. So this presentation is based on a presentation that I presented at the Global Azure Bootcamp. It's an event that happens once a year. This year was Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, about 2 weeks ago. It's a simultaneous event that happens with Microsoft communities everywhere. So this year was invited with the Spanish version of the event in Zaragoza. That's where I had my speaking session. Over the years, I had the opportunity for that same event to speak in Madrid, Barcelona, London, UK twice. So this year, I had the pleasure to speak with the Zaragoza user group. I like to start talking about Azure Virtual Desktop with a little bit of history, right? That's how I usually start conversations. There's always a need to connect people with resources so they can be productive. So historically, not nowadays, the machine you had at work was much better than the machine that you had at home. So you could get to the office and be much more productive because you had a more powerful machine with more resources, with the right management, with the right applications. Over the years, that shift was drifting a bit. Corporate machines were getting more basic and people kind of had better machines at home. So they started demanding the ability to bring their machine into the work. And now we have an opportunity to get companies to provide what users need to be productive with a combination of components that will enable the productivity. So it all started with, I want to connect to a machine. So you go to your own machine or any machine, and it would connect through a protocol, be it RDP, remote desktop protocol, to a existing machine. So that's how you would, from your computer at home, connect to your individual machine at work. This allowed you to have kind of the full presentation of the screen and get the work done. That has some scale issues because you're opening on the firewall a port to go to each machine, and exposing the RDP port can be dangerous. Not recommended. For scale, Microsoft came with the solution of introducing remote desktop services. So remote desktop services is a way to provide at scale the same capability of connecting to a machine, but then no longer to the machine you had at your desk, but a pool of machines, right? Historically, they've been server OSs that allow multiple sessions. So what do I mean by that? So this infrastructure, you would connect to a kind of load balancer that would get you to a gateway that would give you the right machine connected to the other resources you needed. That machine was usually running on a Windows server because until now, that was the only OS that supported multi-session. So you could get a machine, put 32 gig of RAM, put a lot of processing power, some storage at the back end, any way you wanted, and allow people to connect there and get their work done. That service has been around forever, still available. A lot of companies still use it. But because that service relies heavily on server OSs, there were a series of applications that will not run on a server OS. And there was also calls for greater ability to customize the machine you're connecting to allow more kind of personal experience, individualized, and there's a lot of group policies that control better end user experience when it's on a client machine rather than a service. And that's where we saw kind of the explosion of VDI or virtual desktop infrastructure. Still the same concept and idea. You have machines, right? Be it a thin client, a desktop, a laptop, anywhere. You go through a broker, in this case, the view manager, that would give you a machine in a pool somewhere. And at the back, you have the persona and storage array or the user profile. So this is kind of historically what people used to provide remote desktop access, right? You can interchange this one for Citrix, for example, where you can present applications as well as a full desktop. And RDS, you can do that as well. Instead of presenting a full desktop, you can present just one specific application. And you can tier that as well. You can provide a full desktop where the application on those desktops are actually running at another server, and just the application is kind of an RDS application inside an RDS full session. So for that, you required, different licenses, different solutions. And with Microsoft building their cloud offering, they come up with the idea of the Azure Virtual Desktop. So the architecture of the desktop, the virtual desktop, in Azure is, again, very similar to everything we've seen so far. You have a broker that gives you a machine, right, a resource that you have assigned to you. The cool thing about Azure Virtual Desktop is it provides you the ability to give what RDS gave you. So a Windows Server multi-session where you have a pool of machines and people connect and they get assigned to the most appropriate machine based on resource utilization or user allocation. You can also assign them a specific individual machine like VDI did. So you get a Windows 10 or 11 with Office and the applications you need. But it also introduced a Windows 10 and Windows 11 multi-session. So the same thing you could do on a server, you could get a powerful machine with a lot of resources and put a lot of users using the same host to do what they need to do. They released the same thing for clients. So you could have group policy applying, you can have more user experience customizations, and you can have applications that were developed for a client OS and not a server OS running. So that provides a much better user experience for the user and still allows you the control over volume. So that was kind of a welcome addition when Microsoft released Azure Virtual Desktop. So everything I mentioned about Virtual Azure Desktop so far, you can say, hey, but you have the exact same components, right? You have the web access, you have the gateway, the broker. So what's the difference between Azure Virtual Desktop as an Azure workload versus RDS? So the first thing to mention is what's under your control and what's under Microsoft's control. And that's where things get interesting. So what's under your control is the actual full desktops, the applications. You can choose which OS to use, so Windows 10 or 10 and 11 multi-session, servers. There was Windows 7 Enterprise full desktop as an option. I'm not sure if that's still around, but that was the only way you could get a supported Windows 7 desktop. And you manage policies, right? So what your image look like, applications, what type of profile you want. You control how many users per machine, how big is the machine and resources. What are the policies for scaling, right? By default, there's two ways to do load balancing. You can say, hey, fill up this machine first, or have 5 and distribute the users across machines, so there's always a lot of resources available. There's advantages and disadvantages for each of the models, and then you have networking policy. But the cool thing about Azure Virtual Desktop is the areas that Microsoft manages for you. So the broker, load balancing, gateway, and diagnostics is all part of Microsoft offers. So you don't need to set up a front end for the solution. You don't need to manage certificates for it to work. All you need to do is set up the service, set up a host pool, a work group, your applications, and then you publish the machines and people can use, all connecting through the same gateway. And the way you access it, that I'll show you next, is by using your credentials, your normal Office Microsoft account. So you would go to your preferred method of accessing the machine, and you would put your full email address and password to match your Outlook email or your work email. And that device will be provisioned to you. So I think that's a very cool innovation, right? The idea of the multi-session Windows clients and Microsoft managing the components that were harder to configure, scale, and so on. So why those elements make the solution so really, really interesting? Because if you're building a remote desktop solution, be it VDI or remote desktop services, you need to pay in advance for the hardware, or if you lease, right? But you need to procure the whole hardware and licensing for the whole solution for the maximum capacity you're going to use for the period you're going to use it, while you're depreciating that solution licensing and hardware. With the AVD model, what you have is you create a reference image. You can have a mixture between dedicated machines, pooled machines, and pooled server sessions. And you can scale and contract as much as you want, and you only pay for what you're using. A very common tool to add on top of Azure Virtual Desktop, exactly to make that scaling policies much more efficient, is something called Nerdio, which is an external tool to manage. And it helps you keep control of the cost of AVD. Few companies that use AVD with and without Nerdio. The ones with Nerdio always save a significant amount of money compared to the ones that have just scaling policies and scripts to check and so on. So it's a tool that we kind of strongly recommend. Before I go to how you give access and stuff, I want to review a little bit what an architecture of an AVD solution would look like. So here we have the customer network where you have your internal Active Directory servers. Then you have AD Connect Sync, who's then syncing your identities to your Azure AD tenant. And you have different ways to access your Azure. So you have people on Windows, Mac, iOS, Android, Linux, and HTML5. So a TV with a browser will be able to access it as well. You connect to the internet or even on internal machines. You have your gateway to connect to VPN to get to Azure. So that will allow you to publish kind of applications that are on-premise, right? But extending your on-premise network to Azure. So the user experience is those users inside or outside the company go to the internet and they get to the AVD control plane. So where the broker and the gateways are, and that will direct you to the right service. So based on what you have assigned to you, you may have a workspace with applications and host pools. So it will give you a machine that's personal or pooled. So personal is again a machine that's assigned to you as an individual, and pooled is it's usually assigned as a group, and you get one of the machines, any machine that's available. The cool thing is the amount of the way they broke over time, the user profile, user settings, and applications, and you can layer those things in per user. So user profiles, we use FS Logics, which is a company Microsoft acquired that does profile management. So you can mount your profile no matter where you go, any of those machines. And you can provision applications in a multitude of ways. Most people put some, because those are templates, you probably install the base applications of the templates, but you can say, hey, if you're a finance user, you can use MSIX attach, app-attach, for example, or you can just use Intune and make an application available for users to download, depending. There's different strategies to get this running. But MSIX app-attach is something that allows you to have an application on a virtual disk. And then when a user logs in, it just attaches the disk to that virtual machine, and the application is already ready to run. So there's no kind of installation experience. It's effectively mounting an application to a session. and that allows for greater flexibility inside the pools. So there's a lot of components. There's a lot of subscriptions here as well. So if you look at the Microsoft documentation about landing zones and blueprints and the way they architect stuff, there's always different subscriptions for different areas. That's a good way to fence around rights and permissions on different areas of your Azure infrastructure. That's something we architect a lot with our customers, is how do you do segregation of duties? How do you make sure you control costs per area the same way you do on on-premise network? So those different subscriptions will allow you to say, hey, the networking team can manage the network, and you have the Azure costs associated to network as a separate item. And then the operations team can build servers, add applications, have application servers, and so on a separate subscription where they will have the right permissions and so on. And then we recommend subscriptions for bigger applications like AVD. So as you can see, AVD here. So those don't the control plane doesn't require a specific subscription because you don't touch those components, but they're associated with the actual AVD subscription. So AVD as an application, we always recommend a specific subscription. And if you have scenarios where AVDs will be used for very, very different designs for different groups, then you might even think about creating a different subscription for a different AVD implementation. So the experience accessing AVD is quite interesting. So you can use the remote desktop client, where you can see here an example. You have the remote desktop icon where you would get the normal full screen experience of a desktop, but you can also publish individual applications the same way you could do on RDS, but it also allows you to access it through a web page. So literally from any device. There's an interesting community around AVD, and they keep posting, right? Who can actually create a connection to AVD on the most kind of absurd scenarios. So there's pictures of people accessing AVD from fridges, TVs in hotels, and soon we'll probably see it the same way people run Doom on calculators. They'll probably run it on a calculator as well. As long as it accepts HTML5, you can run this. So here's another example of MSIX app attach. So you would have the different users, and based on the VM they log in, they will have the common applications installed. But then if it's a sales user, they'll get the sales app, finance, and tech appropriately. And here's kind of more on the architecture side of that. So you have the file server with the applications being attached to the sessions. So that's a cool way to customize the user experience further by giving them the applications on the fly in a very quick way. One of the most common questions I get when talking about AVD is, hey, I heard about Windows 365. When is it a good idea to have Windows 365 versus AVD? So the end goal, what they offer, is somewhat similar, right? You get a machine you can work from that can be accessed through different ways, right? HTML5 and so on. The biggest difference is Windows 365 is a desktop as a service, right? They call it a cloud PC. So you have your dedicated machine in the cloud, and when you connect, you always get that machine. And it's a one-to-one relationship with the user, and it's a Microsoft 365 cloud service. So it resides inside the Microsoft 365 or Office 365 cloud. AVD sits on the Azure cloud. So the way you license Windows 365 is a Windows 365 license per user. They have a frontline worker version. So if you have a big shift worker, so let's say you're a retail company with different shifts, then the frontline worker can assign 3 people per license, uh, as long as you never exceed, the simultaneous uh, logins for license. But the use case for Windows 365 is you're provisioning one machine to one user, and that user always connects to that machine. Um, the cool thing about it is you don't need any VDI skills, right? You're not managing gateways, imaging, or anything. You're just given a machine that has, Windows 10 or 11 with Office. That's inside your corporate tenant on Microsoft 365, and you can allow users to be productive straight away. So if you're using Office or Microsoft 365 Business, you just provision the machine. If you're using Enterprise, you can attach it to your management infrastructure like Intune. Um, Azure Virtual Desktop on the other side allows you to cover all different scenarios, right? You can have a one-to-one machine, multi-session. AVD is very good for scale. If you're going to be giving everyone a machine or everyone the ability to connect remotely to a corporate machine to do their work, that's the most common scenario. So let's suppose that you want to say, hey, I don't want anyone working on corporate files from their personal device anymore. So provision the ability for everyone to connect on an AVD machine and work from the company. And you can have policies, say no copy paste, no file dragging, no printing to local machines. You can do whatever policies you want to protect the content inside there. One of examples I had with AVD is I used to work for Microsoft, and there was a policy that everyone in Europe except the UK, contractors were no longer allowed to use VPN. But there was a lot of internal websites that we needed to go in to do work. So the workaround we had is, hey, get an AVD session, because once you connect to that full session, it's inside the Microsoft network. So when you're on your machine at home and you couldn't have access to local resources inside AVD, you could. So it's a way to extend the corporate environment anywhere. So, but to do that, you need some, VDI or RDS or Windows management capabilities to use Azure Virtual Desktop. For Windows 365, you don't, right? You just provision a machine to a user, and there's literally nothing else to do, unless you want to tweak the image a little bit. So Windows 365 is also a very good option for companies without a dedicated or specialized IT team. So if you have a small IT team and you want to be able to provide those machines, or even to external people who collaborate sometimes, the advantage is, you pay per month per user, a fixed price on Windows 365. And on Azure Virtual Desktop, you pay, for the different components and the size of the machine and how much connections, how much data. So for multi-session, AVD is the answer. For desktop as a service, Windows 365. And then for personalized persistent desktop, then again, it depends, right? How big your IT team is, how much you can manage it. And there's always cost efficiencies at scale. So if you have a lot of users, Azure Virtual Desktop is a cheap solution. But there would still be some scenarios where Windows 365 is interesting, like you're onboarding a new user, right? So you're separate from the corporate infrastructure. You can get a Windows 365 machine that people can complete, onboarding training, compliance training, upload documents to an intranet. There is a Windows 365 version for developers, specifically where you can create a development machine. They can tinker as much as they can, and they can, delete it and start again, and you have a fresh machine again. Of course, you can do something similar with Azure Virtual Desktop. So the answer is more, it depends, but it's usually down to if you have scale, Azure Virtual Desktop tends to be a better option. If you don't have the in-house skills, it's usually Windows 365. So I have a cloud PC here. Let me log in first. So here's a cloud PC, full screen that we have at the company, Windows 11. You can see it has Intune managing it, so I can come to our company portal and get an application installed. So, Power BI desktop, I can just click on install and Intune will do the work on the background. You can see search is integrated with the company search. So if I search here, it will look for internal resources as well as internet. And I have a full-blown desktop that I can customize any way I want. So in this case, I have here my default browser customization with the Pantone color of the year that I tend to use on as my background as well on Teams, not today, but usually. So, you have a full desktop experience. And this is actually Windows 365, not AVD. But the idea is the same, right? You can access it from web or an RDS client. So the experience is pretty good. The management is the same way you would manage your internal machines. How do I do this? Good. So yeah, so here's an example, right, of using this machine with Intune management. And this is the actual setup of the machine I was using now. It runs through autopilot. So if you're familiar with Intune, you don't need to touch the machines to provision them. Once the user logs in for the first time, it knows that the machine is for that user, and it will configure everything, including applications, policies, and so on. So it transform that machine to the state you want that machine to be ready for the users. Any questions? So there was a question about getting the recording. Yes, this is being recorded and will be posted on the VanTUG YouTube channel. And there'll be a note of it when we publish on the meetup group.